he started with almost nothing. No grand inheritance, no famous name, no spotlight. Just quiet ambition, sharp instincts, and the patience to wait for opportunity. Years later, his name would be whispered across continents, linked to unimaginable wealth, hidden networks, and a fortune so vast it seemed unreal. To the outside world, he looked untouchable, but power built in silence often carries the heaviest shadows. Long before the money, the luxury, and the global reach, there was only survival. Like many who rise from modest beginnings, the early years were shaped by observation rather than privilege. Every transaction mattered. Every connection carried weight. In environments where opportunity felt limited, small advantages became everything. What separated him from others was not just desire, but focus. He understood early that visibility was dangerous and patience was profitable. At first, progress came quietly. No headlines, no attention, just steady movement forward. Small ventures grew into larger ones. Risks were calculated carefully. Mistakes were avoided when possible and managed when they weren't. The key to his rise wasn't speed, it was discipline. While others chased fast rewards, he built foundations that looked ordinary from the outside, but hid far greater intentions underneath. Wealth did not arrive all at once. It arrived in layers. Each layer strengthened the one beneath it. As money grew, so did distance from the original struggle. New environments opened up. New opportunities followed. The world became bigger, not in visibility, but in reach. What once felt like ambition slowly transformed into influence. With influence came a different kind of power. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that moves through conversations, quiet agreements, and unspoken understanding. Doors began opening before they were even approached, barriers lowered without explanation. People listened more closely. Trust, once hard to earn, became automatic in certain circles. This is how the illusion of being untouchable begins, not through force, but through distance from consequence. The genius of his rise was not only in what he built, but in how rarely his name appeared in public view. While others flaunted, he blended. While others sought recognition, he chose privacy. The less people knew, the more they assumed, and assumption became protection. When stories spread, they spread without proof. When questions arose, they were softened by uncertainty. Mystery became its own form of security. At some point, the transformation was complete. The man who once calculated every step now stood at the center of a vast, quiet empire. Wealth no longer had edges. It flowed across borders. Properties, businesses, and networks formed a web so wide that no single thread could explain its shape. To many, he was no longer just successful. He had become a figure of rumor, a name attached to stories that sounded larger than life. And yet in public, he remained almost ordinary. No constant spotlight, no daily headlines, no carefully crafted image seeking approval. He lived not as a celebrity, but as a shadow behind visible success. This dual existence, immense reach paired with quiet presence, made him difficult to define and even harder to challenge. The idea of being untouchable rarely begins as arrogance. It begins as relief. The relief of stability after uncertainty. The relief of control after struggle. And over time, relief hardens into belief. The belief that the past has been escaped permanently. That the system no longer applies in the same way. That risk has been outrun. That the ladder can never be shaken once its top is reached. Wealth changes perspective. Risk begins to feel theoretical. Consequence feels distant. Authority feels negotiable. Life becomes layered with buffers, legal, financial, social. Each buffer adds a step between action and accountability. And when enough buffers exist, the belief in immunity feels natural rather than reckless. What made him truly appear untouchable was not just money, but how rarely anything seemed to reach him directly. Others took falls, others faced pressure, others absorbed attention. He remained still at the center, untouched by the movement around him. This reinforced the illusion not only for observers, but for those closest to the empire as well. If anything went wrong, it never seemed to land where the power truly lived. Fear also played its role quietly. People spoke carefully. Absence of conflict was mistaken for peace. Silence was mistaken for loyalty. But silence can be obedience just as easily as trust. And obedience, when sustained by fear or benefit, can look stable for a very long time. Years passed, wealth compounded. Distance from the origins became total. The past felt unreachable. And when time separates someone from their beginnings long enough, it becomes easy to believe they no longer belong to the same rules that once shaped them. From the outside, the story looked almost unreal. A man who had climbed from unremarkable beginnings to become a figure associated with extreme wealth and international reach. To some, it felt like a legend. To others, a warning. But to him, it may have just felt like inevitability, the natural result of years of calculated movement and controlled risk. The danger of inevitability is that it blinds. When success feels permanent, awareness fades. When protection feels guaranteed, caution weakens. The very habits that built the rise begin to soften. The mind shifts from building to preserving, and preservation often invites predictability. The untouchable image is powerful because it reshapes how everyone behaves. Enemies hesitate, rivals wait, critics fall quiet, and allies grow bold in their confidence. The world bends slightly around those it believes cannot be challenged. That belief becomes real through behavior alone. But no system of power is made of stone. It is made of people, arrangements, timing, and perception. And perception is fluid. It can shift quietly, without warning. The same silence that once protected can begin to isolate. The same mystery that once shielded can begin to attract attention. From the outside, it often looks like the empire is strongest just before its balance changes. The wealth appears secure, the influence looks absolute, the control feels total. But beneath that surface, dynamics are always changing. Loyalties adjust, pressures move. The world does not freeze around anyone, no matter how protected they appear. The rise from nothing to untouchable is always the most seductive chapter of any story like this. It speaks to ambition, to intelligence, to discipline. It shows how far a person can climb when focus meets opportunity. But hidden within that rise is a quiet distortion, the belief that the climb itself has rewritten the rules that govern everyone else. This story reminds us that being untouchable is never a permanent state. It is a moment suspended between ascent and reality, a moment when power feels complete and threat feels distant. But distance is not disappearance, and the laws of consequence do not dissolve just because success arrives first. And echoes always return from somewhere unexpected. What followed was not a collapse that arrived with noise or warning, but a slow revelation of just how much of that empire existed beyond visibility. The second truth of this story is not about riches or reputation. It is about the shadow world that carried those things forward. Because behind every untouched surface, there was a hidden structure built on secrecy, silence, and trust that was never written down. What most people saw was success. What they never saw was the intricate network that made that success possible. Layers of arrangements moved quietly under the surface, bound not by contracts, but by understanding. Business fronts appeared convincing. Transactions looked ordinary. Movements seemed routine. Everything was designed to appear as normal as possible. The greatest protection of the hidden world was how ordinary it looked from the outside. This is how shadow empires survive, not through constant attention, but through constant blending. When something looks familiar, the mind stops questioning it. When patterns repeat without disruption, suspicion fades. Over time, routine becomes camouflage. And within that camouflage, entire systems can grow without ever drawing the spotlight. The hidden structure was never about chaos, it was about order. Roles were clear without ever needing to be discussed publicly. Everyone understood their position without speaking it directly. Silence became the primary currency. Questions were dangerous. Curiosity carried risk. And over time, this environment trained people not to seek clarity, but to accept uncertainty as a condition of stability. What made the empire especially powerful was not intimidation in visible form, but control through dependence. Many lives became quietly entangled in the movement of this world, not always by force, but by benefit. Opportunities appeared where there had once been none. Money flowed into places that had long struggled. For some, this world felt like rescue rather than risk. And once dependence forms, loyalty often follows without being demanded. The shadow world thrives on complexity. The more complex the structure, the harder it is to trace. Paths twist, connections overlap, responsibility spreads outward into so many directions that it becomes difficult to determine where anything truly begins or ends. This diffusion is not accidental. It is protection by design. When no single point carries all the weight, no single point can reveal the whole truth. Inside this world, time moves differently. Urgency exists, but patience is prioritized. Decisions are rarely rushed. Delays are tolerated. Outcomes are measured not in days or weeks, but in years. This long vision creates the illusion of permanence. It feels as though the network will outlast anything that tries to disrupt it. And when that belief takes root, it becomes self-reinforcing. To outsiders, the visible success appears effortless. But behind that surface, the maintenance of silence requires constant adjustment. Every new connection introduces uncertainty. Every expansion creates vulnerability. With growth comes exposure, yet growth is also the measure of survival. To stop expanding would be to weaken. To continue expanding is to risk being seen. This balance is the heart of the shadow world. It is always stretching while trying to remain hidden. It is always moving while trying to appear still. And this tension never disappears. It only evolves with scale. What few realize is that the greatest threat to such systems is rarely outside pressure. It is internal imbalance. When reward begins to outweigh consequence for some and not for others, fractures form quietly. When effort and benefit drift out of alignment, questions begin to surface internally, even if never spoken aloud. The longer the structure lasts, the more it depends on memory rather than accountability. People remember how things are done without fully remembering why. Patterns continue because they always have, and eventually tradition replaces intention. At that point, the system begins to move on its own momentum rather than deliberate control. This is where risk truly grows. Not when the world is watching, but when those inside believe the structure is too large to fail. That belief softens edges. It dulls alertness. It encourages routine over awareness. And routine, in a hidden world, is the most visible thing of all. What sustained the Shadow Empire for so long was not invisibility, but predictability. Everything followed known paths. Everything repeated familiar cycles. Money moved, people moved, decisions moved. The rhythm rarely changed. And rhythm, once established, becomes visible to time itself. From the outside, the shadow world appeared silent. But silence is not emptiness. It is occupation without exposure. It is activity without announcement. It is motion without sound. And motion without sound is often mistaken for stillness. The reality is that no structure built on concealment ever truly rests. It must constantly monitor itself. It must constantly adapt. It must continually guard against shifts that cannot be forecast. And over long periods of time, this constant adjustment becomes strain. As years pass, those once at the center can become increasingly distant from the edges. Decisions are filtered through layers. Information arrives softened. Warnings lose urgency as they travel inward. And slowly, the person at the core begins to experience the illusion of complete safety, not because danger is gone, but because it no longer reaches them in recognizable form. This distance is dangerous. When the center becomes insulated from reality, it begins to act on belief rather than observation. And belief, no matter how confident, cannot replace awareness forever. The Shadow Empire, for all its scale and reach, was still built from human behavior. And human behavior always carries limits. Fatigue enters, trust erodes, assumptions replace verification. And once assumption becomes the foundation of judgment, the collapse begins long before it is visible. What the hidden world never accounts for is time's quiet patience. Time does not expose immediately. It observes. It allows systems to grow comfortable with themselves. It lets repetition become predictable. And predictability is time's greatest ally. From the outside, everything still appears untouched. The empire still stands. The wealth still circulates. The reputation still holds. But beneath the surface, the conditions that once made invisibility possible are slowly rearranging themselves. And when the shadow world finally begins to reflect itself back to the one who built it, it never feels like a warning. It feels like confusion, like uncertainty creeping into spaces where certainty once lived. Familiar stability begins to feel slightly misaligned, not broken, just shifted enough to be noticed. This is the paradox of the empire built on shadows. It appears strongest when it is actually most exposed. It feels safest when it is most predictable. Its silence feels deepest when it is most audible to forces that do not announce themselves. The story of Shadow is not just about concealment. It is about the cost of sustaining what cannot be seen. It is about the burden of maintaining a world that depends on everyone pretending not to notice it. And that burden always grows heavier with time. What ultimately defines such empires is not how high they rise, but how long they depend on absence of attention. Because attention is inevitable. It may be delayed, it may arrive from an unexpected direction, but it always arrives, not because it is summoned, but because time and repetition shape paths too clearly to remain unseen forever. This is the truth behind the second chapter, that while wealth can be accumulated visibly, power sustained through shadow always carries a countdown built into its silence. And that silence, no matter how deep, cannot remain unbroken indefinitely. And yet, when that silence finally bends, it never does so in a straight line. It fractures in quiet, scattered ways first, through unanswered questions, small inconsistencies, and moments that feel out of place but are easy to ignore. For a long time, nothing appears to change on the surface. The same neighborhoods wake up to the same routines. The same doors open and close. The same names circulate in familiar tones. But beneath all of it, something fundamental has shifted, even if no one can fully describe what it is. For someone who has lived behind layers of protection for so long, risk begins to feel abstract. It becomes something that happens to other people, in other places, in other stories. Distance from danger slowly reshapes perspective. Caution gives way to confidence. Confidence becomes certainty, and certainty, over enough time, begins to feel like immunity. That is the most dangerous illusion of all. Because nothing removes a person from the reach of consequence forever. Not money, not reputation, not time. They only delay the moment when reality catches up, and that delay often makes the impact feel even more unreal when it finally arrives. In the final chapter of a life built on control and silence, the world no longer feels like a battlefield or a chessboard. It feels ordinary, quiet, almost peaceful. The sense of urgency that once drove every decision fades into the background. Even vigilance softens when nothing seems to challenge it. And when vigilance softens, awareness goes with it. What remains is routine, familiar paths, trusted spaces, predictable days. These are the things that create comfort, and comfort is where the illusion of safety grows strongest. To onlookers, this stage looks like stability at last. The storms appear to have passed. The danger seems distant. The life that once demanded constant calculation now feels settled. There is space to breathe, to pause, to believe that whatever came before has been left behind. But the past does not fade simply because we stop watching it. It waits the same way silence waits, without sound, without movement, without warning. While a life is shaped by secrecy, there is no clean ending to any chapter. Everything overlaps. Threads from years ago remain loose. Connections once buried never truly disappear. And narratives that feel finished to one person are often still unfolding in someone else's memory. This is where the illusion of control begins to fracture. Because control depends on knowing what still exists beyond your sight. And when something has been hidden for too long, even the one who created the shadows can lose track of what still lives within them. What emerges in this final phase is not chaos, it is uncertainty. The kind that does not announce itself loudly, but lingers in quiet tension. The kind that turns ordinary moments into unfamiliar spaces. The kind that makes even safety feel fragile without anyone being able to explain why. The most unsettling part is that the world outside does not change. People still pass by. Conversations still sound ordinary. The sky does not shift color. Time does not slow down. Everything looks the same, and yet the meaning of everything is no longer the same. For someone who has spent a lifetime shaping outcomes, the realization that something is now beyond control is almost impossible to process because it challenges the one belief that supported everything else, that influence can always reach where it needs to reach. But influence fades where memory persists. In the end, the silence that once protected becomes the silence that explains nothing. There are no announcements, no closure, only absence where certainty once lived. And in that absence, theories begin to grow. Questions multiply, stories diverge. Truth becomes something everyone reaches for, but no one fully holds. This is the haunting nature of an ending shaped by shadows. It does not resolve, it echoes. It invites interpretation without confirmation. It leaves behind not answers, but space. Space filled with speculation, memory, and the uncomfortable awareness that some truths never surface. What remains is not a conclusion, but a question that lingers across years and across lives. How does someone who spent a lifetime managing visibility vanish from certainty in a single moment? How does a life defined by control end in unresolved quiet? Perhaps the answer lies not in the final moment itself, but in everything that came before it. In the years of silence being chosen over clarity, in the power rooted in invisibility, in the structures built to avoid notice rather than to endure truth. When a life is lived in shadow, even its final ending belongs to shadow. And this is the lasting impact of such stories. Not shock, not spectacle, but unresolved unease. The feeling that something important was never fully said. The knowledge that beneath every surface narrative there exists another version of events that will never be completely known. For the families left behind, the questions do not fade with time. They evolve. They shift shape. They return in quiet moments and unexpected memories. For the wider world, the story becomes a symbol, a reminder that power without transparency always leaves wounds that clarity alone cannot heal. In the places where this life once moved unnoticed, routines eventually return. New people walk the same streets. Different names fill the same spaces. And to most, it becomes just another tale folded into the long history of hidden worlds and unresolved endings. But for those who know the weight of unanswered questions, the silence never fully settles. This is not the story of a final moment. It is the story of all the moments that led to one that could never be fully explained. It is the story of what happens when secrecy outlives its purpose, when control outlasts connection, when visibility is avoided for so long that reality itself becomes distorted. And in that distortion, a truth quietly waits, that no matter how carefully a life is hidden, it still leaves echoes, not in headlines alone, not in public memory alone, but in the quiet spaces where certainty once lived and now no longer does. Because even the quietest ending still speaks, and for those willing to listen, it speaks of choices made in shadow, of power built without daylight, and of a final chapter that remains unanswered, not because the truth does not exist, but because it has been sealed inside silence that time itself may never fully unlock. If you want more real UK crime stories told the right way, hit subscribe and stay with us.